have, again, I'll probably tell you guys this next time we have Ben Years is going to be speaking in October. He's out of CHOP, um, and he does amazing work with adaptive skills, and it has a wonderful talk to give us next month on adaptive skills and in autism, and especially for adolescents. I think he's got various projects going, so I'm not sure what he'll focus on. And we have lots of invites out there for other folks that are going to be coming in and giving us talks on Jamie Winter later in the year or early next year. I'll be talking about ESDM. She's one of the country's experts in NDBI. Possibly Jeremy Veenster Vanderweel, Matt Goodwin, Fred Sheik. There's a bunch of people that like it's just over the holidays, it's kind of tough for people to put their money down on when they can make it. Um, so that's first. The second thing I want to talk about was just to acknowledge to the group kind of what happened this last week. And as I think that the talk that we had last month by Amy and then Helen with her coalition of scientists was just so salient now about what she talked about and how she talked about it. Um, so, again, this is apolitical, regardless of your politics. When I tried to listen to the press conference, I personally had to eventually turn it off because I found it hurtful. I found it insulting to me as a scientist, as a professional. Um, but even more so, what I was so bothered about was the families, the impact on the families and the patients this might have. And I can guarantee that all of you are probably experiencing something similar to that, either yourself professionally or personally, or with your families that are involved in. We're getting all kinds of really ominous messages from our universities about what we can say and what we can't say and how we can say it. Which is why, again, what Helen put out last month, I think was so salient in how she's approaching it very professionally and with honest science behind it. So I would encourage you, it's posted on our website, her talk from last month. I would encourage you to go back and look at Helen's talk, Taylor Flassberg, if you haven't, and the Coalition of Scientists. And if you want to join that group or at least be on the email list, it's super, super helpful. I had sent out to the entire IDEA listserv just before this call. The Society of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics put out their messaging statement, which I thought was there's a lot of them out there right now, that are trying to set, the right messaging for it. Here's another one that was put up by the Mind Institute, I think it is. They all kind of say the same thing. It's a focus on the science and it's a focus on what we really do know and how we can best message that to the families in a way that they can hear and be respectful of them and their knowledge and their opinions and their concerns and their worries. Um, and as my boss here reminded us when we talked about it as a center, I mean, the useful thing to do is keep our eyes on the families, regardless of how I react personally or feel personally, really is how can we best serve and help our families the most. Um, the good news out of all this, let me see if I can find this for you guys. Yeah, here we go. I'm gonna call this up for you real quick. Is this. So I had my own concerns about like all these different initiatives that are being put out. So they did finally let us know who the actual funded projects were for one of the initiatives that they put forth, which is the Autism Data Science Initiative. When this came out, we had lots of concerns about the mechanism, how it would work. We still have concerns about how they're going to propagate their information that comes out of it and even how it might go through whatever review process afterwards. But the really good news, guys, is the list of people who actually got funded. I was impressed. There's Wendy Chung, Amy Cochran, Dan Geschwin, Laura Klinger. I mean, these Judith Miller, these are John Sabat. I mean, these are just really, really strong researchers. So I was encouraged at that. I was encouraged by the strength of the researchers and the integrity of the researchers that are getting funded. Again, what happens from there? I don't know, but I took that as really good news. So yay for that. Um, so again, there's lots of messaging out there. I just sent you the ones I thought the family friendly one I really like because I can give that and just hand it out to the families and it's pretty straightforward. But I just want to acknowledge that we're in this together as clinicians. This is one of the venues. This isn't a venue to debate or to, talk in depth about what happened, but it is a venue to find support from your colleagues, and resources that we can do to help ourselves and our families do better. So hang in there. Um, okay, moving on. Dr. Lee is going to talk to us about cultural differences in parental perspectives on autistic traits. One of my goals for IDEA as well is to start to introduce, if we can, more cross-cultural, just to expand our horizons beyond, US centric things. So I'm really excited to hear her presentation and kind of set us on this path of learning more about cultural differences. So with that, I will pass it on to you, Chime.
Thank you so much for the nice introduction and thank you for the opening. I think like we are all in the midst of a lot of different news, so we're all together. Thank you so much for that again. All right, let's see what I can share my screen. But first, I am Chimei Lee. I'm training as a clinical psychology and working as a pediatric neuropsychology at the University of Minnesota. And really lovely to kind of working with a lot of great colleagues and thinking about some of the different nuances about early identification, how to support our family who come to us, and I personally really interested in culture differences just because I am born and raised in a different culture and come and train in the United States. And very lucky to be working with outstanding researcher in both sides. So today I am going to actually presenting on behalf of my team to kind of talking about some of the data we collect. And hopefully we can generate some of the discussion about the measurement that we are using. What are that for? What do we measure? And how could we be better assess and understanding about autistic trait across different consideration? So let's see whether I can share my screen and make sure that's a right forum. Is that good? Great, awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So, the audience has probably already thinking about all this, because like we use in a lot of different psychological measurements in our clinical practice and also in our research setting to help us better understanding about either an individual's presentation or a group presentation. And those kind of measurement and tools are actually designed to capture some of the constructs that is really hard to directly observe. So those are things such as like social communication, social impairment, emotional regulation, anxiety, depression, all sorts of things that we are trying to kind of tackle and do. Um, and when it comes to the autism screening and assessment, and we typically use a lot of mix of standardized measurements or instruments together, that including some of the questionnaires, some of the structure interviews. Also, there are some observational tools that we have been discussed a lot within this format, which is really great because we have a lot of different like tools that we can pull and use. Um, and it also helping us better understanding the presence, the symptoms, the frequency, and also the intensity of the autistic trait. Um, so, and we utilize and rely on those kind of measurement and tools to help us make clinical decisions. And there's a lot of time in the research, especially large scale research, where you utilize those to help us make decision and breaking things or putting individual into different groups to help us better understand either the etiology of autism or other things going on, right? Or assessing like the trace improvement as like the treatment outcome things. So understanding the measurement become really, really important from my standpoint because we are facing some of the challenges is like whether the measurement is actually measuring something that we intended to. So these two are very important, measure certain construct, but also like they also reflect the values, the assumptions, and also the norms of the population in which they are developed. And nowadays, there are a lot of time that we are actually develop those kind of tools in the Western country, and or only including certain groups of people. So that means like we are actually assessing and reflecting certain norms of the traits instead of including a lot of different cultures and things. So so thinking about some of the really common use screener like MChat, SEQ, there were normed in particular groups. They highlight certain traits. They may not be interpreted the same way every other places. So that is, those kind of traits may not equally salient or interpret the same way across all communities. So that creates problems, right? That create different things that we need to consider. So, for example, like independent, that usually are viewed as pretty good in the Western culture. People are like advocated, promoting for our kids to do like their own decision. Whereas in mostly Eastern culture or more collective culture, like independent might view as disobedience, depending on how that presented themselves, right? So you can also think about other things such as eye contact, such as like gestures, such as play style, who they play with, how they socialize with each other, and also how are those emotional expression look like. And those kind of things can vary very differently depending on their culture context. Or thinking about like gender or sex, they might present it differently, or we have different social norms viewing it. So that would also reflecting differently on those measurements. So if we apply standardized scores without really accounting for those differences, we risk two things. We risk to under-identification, under-identify some of the case or children who might need support, or we over pathologizing children whose behavior might be just like typical within their culture or within their communities. So to avoid those kind of risks, I think like it is really important for us to really think about and really understand how our tools functions in their context, either in the clinical context or in the research context, because that will definitely impact how we interpret our result, right? And it will be really important for us to better understand how our tool functioning across different groups. That is not only culture, but also race, gender, what are the languages they're using, and also what their country coming from within the culture context. So we are not just comparing apples to oranges. We're trying to kind of compare the same thing so that we can answer the important questions we wanted to answer. Okay. So that just like lay out some of the things that I wanted to talk about today. And actually, I'm going to focus on culture aspect here, um, and particularly for parental perspective. Because what we know, like autism spectrum disorder, what we think about it right now is more like a neurodevelopmental condition that often thought to be universal across different group, culture, or countries, right? We view it as that. And we think it's universal because we believe that it's sharing some of the underlying biological foundations such as maybe genetic factors playing into it, some of the brain-based variability might play into it, that those things contribute to the autistic trait across individuals in groups. Um, and I think the difficulty right now we are facing as clinician, myself, is that we are not quite yet have a really good, definite biomarker for us to really know whether that's autism or not, or whether a kid is on the spectrum or not, right? So like we are heavily relying on some of the behavioral observation or parental reports to help us try to differentiate like whether the kid's on the spectrum or not. So the parental perspective becomes super important in this picture and in this puzzles. And it will really impacting whether a kid or a child assessing for services or not. Um, so on top of that, the way those behavior are recognized and described by the caregiver and the providers may not always the same, and it's highly impacted by the cultural neutral. So the cultural norm, like the SES background, their mental health literacy, all shapes how people interpret and report what they see. So like I just give you one of the quick example about independence, but there are definitely other things more related to autistic presentation and social norms. So, for example, communication styles. In the US or Western culture, like eye contact is usually encouraged and being flagged as one of the really important things when we consider autistic presentation. Whereas in the East Asia like regions, avoiding direct eye contact can show respect, especially with like authorities. So like directly looking at people into the eyes may not always feel like that is really appropriate in the social setting. Whereas language development, like Western culture, usually really like focus on the early language development, and it's usually like being voiced as a concern by a lot of like Western culture parents. Whereas some the Africa culture or like in Asian countries, they're less focused on early speech development. Um, some of the like nonverbal communication are really valued. And also they're giving more times and feel like the kids are going to catch up later. So developmental milestone in the parents' eyes might be shift a little bit compared to the Western culture. Social behavior independence, like independence are valued in the Western culture most of the time. People or parents are more like promote their kids to self-feeding themselves, separate sleeping condition, or promoting their early choice making. Whereas, like in Japan, particularly, or other collective cultures, they're more value about interdependence. So that means like they are co-sleeping with their kids. Parents are more wanting to leading their kids' decision, especially in their early life or school age. Um, Whereas like in Latin America, that the familial closeness are actually highly valued. They are emotionally like, attached to their family and really value about those kind of dependence too. Play part, that's another important thing we consider, right? So in the Western culture, child lead, imaginative play are really emphasized early on. And we would really highly praise kids when they're being creative and encourage those kind of behavior in play. Whereas in some of the culture in Asia, um, more like structured play, more academic related play are being emphasized and introduced to their kids. Um, they're emphasized about group harmony. So that means like they're encouraged kids to be blended into the group and follow the lead of other peers instead of like creating their own, being imaginative sometimes. Um, and in some of the like documents saying in Africa countries, some of them are like follow the older kids lead. And a lot of time adults are relatively involved in kids like play in that setting. Um, and the last one, the stigma and the willingness to report symptoms. That's really linked toward the attitude toward disability or the differences. So a lot of time, I think like in the Western culture, we're more increasing about acceptance and willing to like understanding about neurodiversity. And we have like a relatively better support system in place compared to a lot of different countries. Whereas in different country, different region might have different pace in their systems. And some of the stigma can still persist. Family may avoid getting a diagnosis, especially related to mental health. Autism can be a super big words or even not a word in their culture and country. Um, and some of the parents may not want to disclose their kids have differences compared to other people or other children's. They might intend to hide or only consult with their like elderly within the family. So there are definitely still a lot of different things that we need to consider. So I just like listed some. And as you can see, some of the things I mentioned is already very related to what they are going to report to a professional. And those kind of things are not only unique outside of the United States. Many of us probably encounter like people coming from different culture backgrounds, and they might report and say things or rate things slightly differently compared to what we would expect. So that might be really important to consider or prompt us to kind of ask a little bit more, have better understanding where the parents or the kids coming from. Uh, So what I mentioned here, I'm trying to say is like we need to acknowledge those kind of differences and put into consideration when we are getting the result and having the assessment there. And I also wanted to kind of like have a better understanding about what does that look like scientifically and see whether we can kind of like really identify some of the culture differences within the measurement that we are actually using. So I'm very lucky in looking and having the data of one of the commonly used measurement that is social responses scales. So those scales being developed by Dr. Constantino has been like widely used and translated into so many different languages across the world. And the goal for this particular measure, SRS, is assessing the severity of social impairment within the thoughts like related to the autism spectrum. So since it has been published, right now it's the second edition. There are several different culture variation has been reported in the literature. So for example, like from the country I'm coming from, my dear heart, from Taiwan, we had found that the SRS actually have a four-factor structure instead of the five-factor structure that is being reported in the United States. And among the 65 items that being like translated and assessed in Taiwan, there were five items being removed because they're not highly correlated to the other like 60 items here compared to the US sample. In other like East Asia countries, like in Korea, using the SRS as it is, the researcher found that Korea sample actually have lower cutoff scores. That means like they suggest like using the T-score above 55 to identify kids that who have like autistic like traits or having social impairment within their sample. In Japan, very similar things found out. They have lower cutoff point, but also significantly lower sensitivity in girls, particularly in the Japanese sample. In Iran, that is really interesting. When they're looking at the SRS raw score, they found a higher raw score compared to the US like average. Means like the Iran parents may be like reporting higher things or like more severe things in their particular sample. Whereas in Canada, like parents more likely to report lower overall score compared to the United sample. And similar to Japan, their girls are more likely to under-identify solely based on the SRS scores. So here are just like a snapshot of things. There are definitely more study out there talking about different cultures and different groups. Um, but like here I wanted to highlight is that yes, the SRS is probably like most of us are using it, and it's very, very easy to use in the large scale study, especially for genetic study or brain imaging study, just because this is relatively easy, relatively, and able to kind of give us a like scalable score to kind of estimate about the autistic trait severity to help us find out what are the correlation with a certain brain region or what is the like gene loading onto certain traits. But across different cultures, there are definitely some of the items are not functioning well as we will like them to be. So here comes my question is that how is that work out, particularly in the US and Taiwanese sample? So if I have a brain imaging sample right now in those places, can I combine it to become a bigger sample size to help us answer better questions? Um, so the goal here is that I wanted to examine the cultural similarity and differences in the like two sample across US and Taiwanese population to try to inform a better like equitable assessment practice. And I'm trying to explore the factor structure of the SRS across culture, try to assess the culture differences on measurement, and like help us inform about the interpretation, especially investigate some of the potential confounding factor, such as sex that we just mentioned about like girls and boys, um, familial likelihood, and also the diagnosis. So here is the sample size that I'm going to focus today. So I'm very lucky to be working with one of the longitudinal cohort study called the IBIS, the Infant Brain Imaging Study. It is under the longitudinal research network in the North America, study infants who are at higher familial likelihood. That means that they already have a biological sibling who is being identified as autism, and we including the younger sibling when they are 6 or 12 months old and continue to track their developmental trajectory until they're school age. And right now they are in their adolescence, so we are able to kind of see the trajectory and trying to figure out how they are similar or different from other kids who we consider as neurotypical. And as I'm working in the University of Minnesota in the Mosaic Brand Institute for Developing Brand, the MIDB, we also have like a very dedicated specialized clinic for autism diagnosis. So we are able to kind of combine those samples together, have a like 808 kids who are like either diagnosed with autism or not, in their mean age is like 11 years old. And with Dr. Susan Supergao's support, she leading a longitudinal study in Taiwan, collecting like over 1,000 kids who are either have autism, including their siblings, and also a big group of controls. So the mean age there is also 11 years old, so not big a differences between those two data sets. So here is just like a little bit breakdown of like their gender, their sex profile, sex assigned at birth, their familial likelihood, which is really nice that we have that reach data can kind of test a little bit about that, and also their final diagnosis, whether they have autism or not. So autism plus means like they have a final diagnosis with autism from behavioral assessment and also their medical provider, either clinical psychologists or pediatricians. And autism minus is like they are not meeting the diagnostic criteria for autism. So as you know, that I am particularly focusing on the SRS. So just like giving a little bit background about SRS, most of you probably already know, so I'm not going to go into detail of it. So SRS is 65 items using the 4 Likert scale to kind of rate about social skills across different range. They also have like items talking about RB, the restricted repetitive behavior, and some of the unusual play. So in the US version, right now we have the SRS2. And this particular study, we focus on the school age form, which is for like kids for and up until like age 18. So originally, Dr. Constantino published it, and SRS2 has another like really important study by Dr. Frasers back in 2014. And in that psychometric paper, they identify like 2 factors and 5 factor model. So 2 factor model is actually very consistent with what our current understanding of the DSM-5. They have like social communication and interaction as 1 factors. And the other one is the RB, the restricted repetitive behavior. In using the item bucket method, they identify 5 factor models, and they are really nicely tagged into the 2 factor models there. Otherwise, though originally Dr. Constantino and Christian also identified five treatment scales, which has a hard time to be verified into other replicate study, but has some clinical meanings and interpretation that sometimes that we may use in a clinical setting. In the Taiwanese data, Dr. Susan Gao and her team translated into the Chinese version, and they test about their psychometric property and compared to other things. So what they found out is that they reveal like among the all 65 items, there are 60 items are good and able to continue to go on for the factor analysis. Five items were eliminated, which is item 11 has a good self-confidence, which we kind of like imagine that can be slightly different. Item 40, it's imaginative, good at pretending play, which can be another item that we just talked about the placing. Item 43 separates easily from caregiver. So again, we're talking about different culture might have different things about independence and interdependence. Um, Item 48, that is, has a sense of humor, understanding jokes. So again, that's another items that have like slightly different at original Chinese version. And item 55, know when he or she is too close to someone or is invaded some other people's space. So again, personal space can be like difficult to interpret or difficult to assess across different culture backgrounds. So after eliminating those five items, Dr. Kao's study identified four-factor models within those 60 items. So those are the factor structure they are suggesting there. So the questions before we wanted to jump into and compare the two sample size, we need to kind of see whether the factor structure are actually compatible across different group. Okay, let's see. Yeah, here. So first, we wanted to explore compatible factor structure of the SRS across Taiwan and US. So we actually know that we're actually compare apples to apples instead of apples to orange, right? So we utilize a lot of statistic approach to try to make sure that we are compared the same thing. Since we already have study out there to kind of like check about factor structure, so first we use like Taiwanese data factor structure and see whether that will fit with the US samples. And what we found is that no, that's not good. We also use the US sample, the US factor structure, and see whether that will fit with the Taiwanese sample. And well, not very good. So at the end, we need to kind of rerun our factor structure using the EFA based on our current data set. And we use an 1 to 5 factor solution based on the previous literature. And what we found based on the current data, only factor like one factor or two factor models will fit. Three and above, it's just like not able to find a good solutions for that. So we went on to continue to compare whether the one factor model or two factor model solutions is good in explaining the same thing. That means like whether the one factor model in the US sample is that the same in the Taiwanese sample. And what we found out is that yes, if we're using the one factor solution, the Tucker congruent coefficient is like very close to one. That means like they are actually considered as equal among them. However, when we are looking at a two-factor solution, they're actually not very good on that. Um, am I still sharing my slide? Yeah, cool. Okay. So the two-factor structure, the first factor is fairly similar, but the second factor were very poor. So we decided to win on the one-factor solution. That means like testing and treating the SRS as unidimensional. And as you can imagine, that just means like we are like treating autism as a whole and testing about the autistic trait as a whole instead of like looking at social communication and RB. Okay, all right. So I wanted to show you a little bit about the factor structure there. And this is the result of every single items of it. Um, and here you already can see some of the factor loading is probably not super nice across the board, right? So the X are the item level, and item 43 has really, really poor and close to zero loading on the Taiwanese sample. And it was not super hot for the US sample as well, as the vector loading was relatively low. But there are definitely some of the items functioning pretty well on the factor loading. So like item 8, item 14, and so on and so forth. So just giving you a sample about like across different items, they are actually function and loading onto our latent construct differently. Okay. All right. Let's see. Oops. Yeah. And this is another plot to kind of show you how are the factor structure congruent together. So in the Taiwanese sample, yes, as you can see, the eigenvalue, one factor model is actually working out pretty nicely for them. And so as for the US sample. So just give you a sample here. All right. Um, do we have a question? What is item 43? Good question. Item 43 is separates easily from caregiver. I know it would come up, but it's just not very nice item in both simple, actually, I'll have to say. All right. So once we decided about our vector structure, now we can kind of start to test around the factor in measurement invariance. That's actually comparing like, hey, whether this particular measure functioning differently on those two sample size. So we test the one vector structure using a GRM, the graded response model, within the IRT, the item response test. So all the like assumption were met. So it means that we can go ahead and test it out. Um, so depending on the time, we can kind of keep going into it and show you the result here. Here, let's see. So this is the item probability figure to show you. As you can see, like the upper left is the Taiwanese sample and the bottom right is the US sample size. And it's plot every single items to show you the item function and probability. And because this is a 4 item leaker, so you should see like some of the item is actually covered from the left right to the like in the left upper to the right. So for example, the 4 light item should be crossed over instead of like flat. So some of the item really gray, you can see the upper right here, those are gray item. But for the item 43, that is pretty flat. That's actually telling us that the item for parents indoors 1, 2, 3, 4, there are actually no difference. Mhm. Yeah. We also examine for the information across different items. So typically we will wanted to see a bell curve like this. So the big figure are the total information that SRS shared with us. And the little figure for the item form is telling well, how each item telling us information related to their latent structure. And as you can already see in the Taiwanese sample, there are definitely some items are not functioning really well. Again, I'm going to point out the item 43 just because that is very clear. And this item is not well because that's pretty flat. Even though the US sample size generally performed pretty well, but there are also some of the item is not as ideal as we would like to. So after checking that, then we are able to kind of utilize the differential item functioning to kind of really looking at every single item. How is that functioning across it? Okay, so I'm going to skip those kind of statistic thing, but just wanted to show you how we are comparing. So as you can see the figure on the right, if they're not matching together, that means like this item are actually functioning differently across different groups. And those groups can be different culture group, can be different sex group, can be different age group, or whatever that you wanted to separate them into different groups. Um, so let's look at the result. So among the whole sample, in the Taiwanese and the US sample, there are several items that are just not functioning similarly. So there are 9 items being identified. And all of the 5 items originally be eliminated by the Taiwanese study are all in there. So here I list out all the items here for you, and you can see where the items are there. So item 7 is aware of what others are thinking or feeling. Item 11 has a good self-confidence. Item 38 responds appropriately to mood change in others. 40, imaginative, good at pretending. 43 is separates from caregiver. 45, focus on his attention. Um, and or like, oh, focus his attention to where others looking or listening. 48 has a sense of humor. 55 knows he is too close to someone, or 63 touch others in an unusual way. Yeah. Mhm. Okay. And this is the diff figure that should show you how they are different from each other. So the black dot is actually the Taiwanese sample item functioning, and the red one, red dash dot, is the US sample. So as you can see, they are shifting or even like functioning totally differently from each other. As you can see the item 43 here over like Taiwanese sample just don't have any information whatsoever. Um, yeah, that's just like an example for you. Mhm. And another important thing is that we wanted to see how those diff items are actually performing at the end of all the like samples. So I will bring your attention to the right figure over here. So to examine the impact of the diff of individual level, we are actually compare each person's initial score. That is what they call about the native theta estimate with the purified score that actually correct the diff. So in this form, you can see like the differences show as the initial minus the purify. That means like after we adjust for the culture differences in each item, how is the overall score function for us? So the positive number means the person original score was a little bit like inflated and has no and now has to be adjusted down. And a negative number means like the opposite. That means the original score is a little bit too low and need to adjust up. And the axis here is the latent construct. So higher score means like they are more related to like the autistic trait, and the lower number here is actually not super related or not loading the latent construct, which is the autistic trait here. So you can see a very beautiful split between the US sample and the Taiwanese sample. That means like in the Taiwanese sample, um, almost like no difference between Taiwanese sample and the US sample in those kind of highly autistic related items, because like they are very, very close to the zero in the middle. But at the lower autistic trait items, the story changed. The Taiwanese participant or Taiwanese parents are tended to have score. They are inflated at first, whereas the US participants are more likely to deflate it. So adjusting to the other direction. So as you can see, those diff items really impacting what are the raw score, especially the total score they are generating. That really shows like the culture differences there very, very clearly and beautifully. Okay, so thinking about time, I wanted to jump to our discussion. So the main takeaway is that yes, SRS is a great measure. They have like a lot of really good impact, but like at least among the US sample size and the Taiwanese sample size that we are examining today, there are at least 9 items that were not doing well in those two cultures. So when you are seeing those 9 items, you might want to second think of it. And those are some of the things that being listed out as your experience for your reference. And I think the main takeaway is that the culture differences mainly detected within the autism negative sample size, because we also breaking group down between the autism positive and autism negative, between different familial likelihood, and between sex. And surprisingly, sex didn't make a differences among those two culture groups, whereas autism diagnosis is actually driven the main differences that we consider or we detect for the culture part. So this really tells us that parents from Taiwan and the US report very similarly long items that are closely aligned with the core autistic features. But for those items that are not directly related to the autism trait, that was not found to have like good factor loading onto our latent construct, they are really reporting very different patterns among US and Taiwanese sample. So they're actually telling us that, yes, there are definitely some traits are universal across two different cultures within Taiwan and US. Um, and those kind of cultural influences are there, but not super infected about really highly focused or culturally robust items on the SRS. Those items being influenced by the cultures are some of the items actually not loading really well onto the latent construct. So we need to consider cultural influences. We need to think about it, but no, don't need to really super panic about it. So my future direction is actually trying to find out some of the cultural robust items across the US and Taiwan's data set. Right now, we are able to identify several items, and we would like to kind of compare to the sets that is actually existing right now for the SRS short version. There are 11 items out there and 16 items out there. So if those are really highly compatible, then we can kind of utilize those to kind of inform our clinical and research direction. Also, we are trying to verify using different Asian country. So we're lucky to have like collaborated in Hong Kong as well and also in Singapore. So we're lovely and able to kind of like verify this sample and finding to see whether some other Eastern culture also showing similar things. And if we can replicate in other like bigger sample size in the United States as well, that would be really helpful. So that helping us better understand, is that just like solely for this particular sample size, or is it more like universal phenomena across the culture? And I really wanted to encourage everyone to think about measurement again. Um, is like what we are really measuring. So when we are using a measure, what we are doing, what we are trying to get from it, and how well does our measurement work? And measurement are always like pretty good, solid for psychometric property, but they might limit it for certain groups they are being studied for. So what is that for and under what conditions? Maybe something that we can continue to ask ourselves before we interpret our results. So I wanted to end here and hopefully still have some time for people if you have any questions.
Thank you so much. You can stop sharing if you want. So
Sure.
first of all, congratulations on the depth of your analysis of the data. That is freaking impressive. I mean, you looked at this stuff every which way you can. And I wish every measure was put to that level of rigor when it's used across cultures. Uh, just because it's translated doesn't mean it's validated. So I think that's super important, the work that you're doing. And it's not only interesting from a psychometric standpoint, but from just what it tells us about the cultures. It makes me think a lot about like, why are those questions different? What does this mean culturally? And what does this mean and how does it relate to how we think about autism? I do have a quick question for you, and then open it up. Please raise your hand or unmute and ask another question if you have one, or just if you want to turn your camera on, that will signal to me that you have a question. But having done some of the translation work myself with some measures, I'm curious your thoughts on how much do you think this has to do with the question itself, meaning the actual content, meaning intended content of the question versus potential language difficulties? Because sometimes the translation, even if back translated back and forth, you lose something, and there might not be the right word. So I just want to get your thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you so much for bringing it up. Especially at the beginning, I talk about some of the thing or some of the concept may not be always happening in that particular cultures and in that language, right? For the Taiwanese sample and Taiwanese translation, I personally very privileged, able to kind of like participate in some of the like translation work there too. So I think like now after 10 years, I'm looking back about our translation. I feel like that is actually carry very, very similar meanings in the English version of it. But it's like whether the parents also really understanding what we're asking. So for example, humor. Humor can be one thing. Yes, we have words in like Mandarin talking about humor, but is that content the same quality of the things that we are saying? Because like joke usually carry a somewhat not so great meaning in the Mandarin speaking, depending on different contexts. So I see what you're saying, but also at the same time, it make it a little bit hard to assess and quantify in those kind of meaning. So that's a really good point, and that's also a lot of people are discussing that. So some of the quality work to kind of like really depicting about what does that look like, what kind of thing, or maybe we should do more in-depth interview to get what parents are meaning after those kind of question there will be really helpful to understanding what they're seeing and what they're looking at.
Thanks. I don't see anyone raising their hand, so I'm going to ask another question. Please
Yeah,
raise
please.
a question. So in your work in this space, now this is kind of a speculative question.
Mhm.
I see you've done a lot of work on the SRS, but just your opinion as a clinician in this space, are there other measures that you're like, ooh, we should be really careful with this measure because of the possible or potential cultural differences in it? Is there, other than the SRS, is there anything you're like, oh, be careful about that measure?
Yeah, well, here I think definitely there are a lot of gold standard measure or what we feel like would be really important measure. And there are definitely some of the other people are studying at is the ADOS. So ADOS is definitely really relying on what we are doing, how we are doing, how we are interpreted the kids' presentation, and what are the like material that we are presenting out. So I think like Dr. Ling, if I'm not remember the wrong name, and they're actually like studying a little bit about like within different culture how the ADOS are actually carried out. And I personally able to kind of like see some of the like reliability coding here. So for example, the United States map is not work out for other culture most of the time when you are trying to generating some of the discussion and getting conversation going, right? So it's really nice to kind of see the updated version of it. Right now, we are including the world map or things like that. But it might be more connecting to the participant if we have something related to their culture, their country, and thinking about whether that kind of variation will be acceptable or not. If our purpose is actually get a conversation going and thinking about whether they can describe like information in the sequential things. So that's just one example. SCQ definitely have some work in the culture relationship too, and some of the items that's definitely not functioning well. Similar ways as we examine the SRS, as you can imagine. Some of the early identification skill that we are constantly using, like MChat, are also have different things across the board. So yes, I know some of the outstanding researchers are doing that, so I'm really appreciate all the people are doing that work. It's just like how we disseminate so that we are all understanding and using it as intended to. So that will be really important for us to keep up to date to the science here.
One cool approach that I hope that you actually do would be to be able to, instead of diving that far in a measure, not instead of, but in addition to,
Mhm.
like if there are these cultural differences in items across measures that are
Mhm,
similar, that we
mhm,
can then extract, oh, be careful if we're going to be using this in this culture. These are the things that might be different that would apply across all the different measures that you have. I think that'd be like super interesting. But um, yeah, so I'm looking at she's someone had posted. And then what this is the last question. Then I have one final thing to say before we end. I'm curious if you have any suggestions for clinical practice in terms of autism diagnosis and working with Chinese population to help highlight cultural differences in strength. This seems like a really big question. Do you have a 30-second answer to that?
That'll be hard. Oh my God. I think we definitely need to kind of pay close attention to what other people are suggesting about like eye contact or separation, independence, and play. And those are the items that are being flagged here in the SRIs as well. So you as a clinician in your culture probably better understanding what is the norm within your culture. So I think like as we always encounter with kids with neurodevelopmental differences, sometimes we need to see some typical kids and get refreshed about our norm too. So get too close to your culture and get the norm yourself so that you can see the differences across the board.
Excellent. 20-second answer. That was really good. And again, like Nuri had put on, there's all kinds of other cultural differences in Spanish cultures and others. And um, well, thank you so much for your generosity with your time and the rigor in your research. It's very, very appreciated and well done. Um, I had posted real quick. My medical director just sent out because it's not to take away from your talk. It was relevant to our prior introduction that this article just came out in the New York Times with four different individuals with different perspectives. I think the firewall or whatever it is, the paywall is off of that link if you want to access it real quick. But several different people talking about their perspectives, which is really kind of enlightening as well. So, um, well, community, keep your heads up, stick together if we can. It's hard times, but we'll do our best. So, we will see you all next month when Ben comes to talk about adaptive skills and autism. Looking forward to it. But thank you all and have a great rest of your September and beginning of October. Bye, everybody.